Hello, and welcome to World Religions, Hinduism, and Buddhism. Before we get started, I would like to provide an overview as to what we're going to accomplish in this lecture. We're going to start with the caste system in Hinduism, move on to the different kinds of Brahman, the god of attributes and the god without attributes. Then we're going to move on to the coming of age in the universe, when we go over more of the philosophical side of Hinduism, more importantly, reincarnation and the progression of the individual soul, or jiva. After that, we discuss the implications of the Hinduist philosophy and how that correlates to accountability and the three modes of consciousness in the world. Then we will conclude Hinduism with the many paths to the same summit. This brings us to the discussion of Buddhism, in which we discuss Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha himself, his life and legend. Then we transition into the silent sage, the rebel saint, and then discuss original Buddhism as it applies to Hinduism. So that is what we are going to discuss in this lecture, and with that, we'll move on to the first topic. So first up is the very controversial caste system. Not something we're going to spend too long on in this course. As we discussed earlier, theory and philosophy is our focus. But in order to understand Hinduism's philosophies, as well as later on Buddhism, we need to have at least a minor understanding of the caste system. So originally in the caste system, society was divided into four groups: seers, administrators, producers, and followers. One of the perversions, though, was a fifth group called the untouchables that were considered the lowest of the social group. Other perversions included deterioration and proliferation of castes into subcastes, the privileges that would enter the higher castes benefiting at the expense of the lower, as well as the caste system becoming hereditary. So then that begs the question, how the most tolerant nation in the realm of ideas could also be the least tolerant nation in social forms. Well, there was a reason for the caste system, and one reason is they felt it was a moral obligation to separate the weak from the strong, because unless unequals are separated in some fashion, the strong will always dominate the weak. And the caste system itself promoted individual rights within the castes. For outside the castes themselves, there was no equality. Also, they had an interesting notion of justice and came very close to the belief that the lower caste, the Shudras, could do no wrong because they were seen as children, as justice itself was defined as a kind of proportionate to responsibilities. So the more responsible, like the Brahmins, could be held responsible in the aspect of justice, while the lower Shudra shouldn't be. So the caste system itself was split up into the Brahmins, who were the reflective ones with a passion to understand and a keen intuitive grasp of the values that matter. The second group, composed of the administrators, or Kshatriyas, were responsible for orchestrating human talents. The third group are your artisans, your producers, farmers, skillful at creating material things, or Vaishyas. And then the fourth group, the followers, or Shudras. They're unskilled labor that need intense supervision to learn the skills of a producer. Now, within the caste system, there were certain protections that need to be administered. For example, temporal power was to be restricted from the highest caste. India believed Plato's dream of the philosopher king was unrealistic. And real quick, this idea that Plato had was the wisest should rule the nation. Of course, the wisest were those who sought out knowledge, literally philosophia, searchers of wisdom, or philosophers. Thus, philosophers should be the only ones who become kings. But again, for India, this was unrealistic. Because while it is true that the Brahmins eventually assumed social power and became corrupt, the idea or role of the seer was not to crack down, but to console. They weren't to drive behavior, but to guide behavior. So they were not the enforcers, but the counselors of society. And now we will shift to the different kinds of Brahman, where we get into the philosophy of Hinduism, as thus far our focus has been more pragmatic. But before we get into the different types of Brahman, we need to go over the limitations of understanding as it correlates to human reasoning. In the Houston Smith text, it talks about the human mind as adapted to deal with finite objects. But God, on the contrary, is an infinite object, completely different than what we've experienced. Now, an 18th century philosopher named David Hume, who was an empiricist, really brought this to the forefront, this limitation of human reasoning, because he was able to show that all of our ideas were copies of impressions. That is to say that everything we can think of has been impressed upon us by outside experiences. So everything within our minds are either simple ideas or complex ideas, which means they are either singular experiences or combinations of experiences. So when I experience red on a rose, the color red is imprinted in my mind as an impression. And then I can combine that into a complex idea by adding red to an elephant. So a red elephant or a pink elephant. Those who have taken my introduction to philosophy, this is review. But Houston Smith puts it a different way, saying expecting our minds to understand or comprehend the infinite in life is like asking a dog to understand Einstein's equations with its nose. You can reach God, but not with the rational mind. The rational mind is limited to experience, that which it sees. And the only thing we see is the finite. But God needs to mean something to us. So with that comes two different types of God. You have a God that's easier to understand. It's more parental, loving, merciful, omniscient, almighty, internal, contemporary, basically like a companion who understands. And this is the God of attributes, or saguna. And then there's the God without attributes, nirguna Brahman. Houston Smith describes this as the God of philosophers, a vast ocean, as opposed to the God with attributes that is a vast ocean, but one that is alive with swells and waves. This is the difference between the personalist and the transpersonalist. As the personalist will see little religious availability, according to Houston Smith, in the idea of a God who is so far removed from our predicaments that he is unaware of our very existence. There's no personality to him. That's why in Hinduism you see these preservers, these destroyers, these very personal reflections of God. Now, God serves an entirely different function for the transpersonalist. This individual is entirely focused on the end goal of religion and doesn't need the master swimmer by their side, but sees the shore and solid scene that lies beyond the struggle. Now, with that in mind, we can move on to the individual soul and its progression. The coming of age in the universe. Now, according to Hinduism, the individual soul, or jiva, is born into the world. There's a really nice example that Houston Smith gives here, like the boiling tea kettle. So The individual soul is born like a bubble that is formed at the bottom of a boiling tea kettle that makes its way through the water, which symbolizes the universe, until they break free into the limitless atmosphere of illumination or liberation. Now, at first glance, you may read this as a single lifetime. You're born and then you die, but that is not the case. For Hinduism, there is a belief in a constant cycle of rebirth and death. That is why eventually all bubbles will reach the surface. It just takes some longer than others. As discussed last week, this liberation or reaching the surface and expanding into the infinite atmosphere is moksha. But this constant cycle of death and life and rebirth is known as samsara. And then the mechanism that ties these acquisitions together is the law of karma, or the moral law of cause and effect. That is the purpose of the yoga that we discussed last week, a way to whittle down one's karma in order to break the cycle of samsara and reach moksha. But if there is a moral law of cause and effect, that implies two important personal responsibilities. One is, as Hinduism understands it, that karma is one's personal responsibility. Everyone gets exactly what is deserved. We made our beds, now we lie in them. It also effectively closes the door on chance and accident. For accidents and chances just covers one's ignorance. One example that often comes to mind is the rolling of the dice. Now, if a person was able to recreate the exact wind and angle they roll the dice, they'll hit the same number over and over again. But what we call random is our ignorance of all of the cause and effect relationships that occur with the dice roll. So we simply defer to chance as a way to shirk our responsibilities. So karma decrees that every decision must have its determinate consequence, but the decision themselves are freely arrived at. Thus, the soul's progression through the cycle of samsara is littered with personal responsibility. And when we are first born, all we want is pleasure, all the fun we can handle. But with this repetition, we get bored and move on to social success and wealth. This is what we went over last week. But as far as the tea kettle example, this is the fumbling and zigzagging of the bubble towards the top. It only moves upward with the gradual relaxation of attachment to physical objects and stimuli. The nucleus, however, the nucleus of this bubble is the Atman, the God within, exerting its pressure to come out of the bubble like a jack-in-the-box. This theory of the gradual relaxation of attachment is better elucidated in the story of the Kalpataru tree that fulfills all wishes. But the main point of the whole story is that the universe is one gigantic wishing machine. You get what you ask for in this cycle or one of the various cycles that follow. That is karma. With this understanding, we will now transition to the world welcomes and farewell. The world, welcome and farewell. In this section, they go over the moral universe and the implications of the Hindu beliefs of karma. The first point is addressed early, in which it says, as far as moral character goes, this is a just world where everyone gets what is deserved and creates his or her own future. Now, this is distinct from fatalism. Nothing is fated or determined to happen. You make decisions, outcomes occur. There is free will. The second point that is made is that as far as the world is concerned, it hangs midway between heaven and hell, described as the heavens above and the hell below. in which good and evil, pleasure and pain, knowledge and ignorance interweave in about equal proportions. This completely nullifies the idea of utopia. There will always be good and bad. There will always be pleasure and pain. Utopia does not exist. So in regards to karma, the world is the soul's gymnastics. It schools and trains us. What we do is important, but ultimately it is important for the discipline it offers to our individual character. And then fundamentally, we view the world in three distinct modes of consciousness. The first one is hallucinations, basically that which is corrected by further perception. Oases in the desert, seeing somebody who you think is your friend and they turn around and is not. So in other words, the blanket of false perception. The second mode of consciousness is the world as it normally appears to the human senses. And then there's the third mode of consciousness, the world as it appears to the yogis, who have risen to a state of superconsciousness. A world which Houston Smith describes as no world at all, because every trait that carries characteristics as we normally perceive things vanishes. Materiality vanishes. This leads Houston Smith to point out that for Hindus, they see the world as we perceive it, that second mode of consciousness, as Maya, often translated into the illusion. But that is not to suggest that the world doesn't need to be taken seriously. The Hindus are quick to point out that as long as that world looks real to you, we must accept it as such. But for those who reach that superconsciousness, the aspect of the world as we perceive it, or that Maya, is akin to a child watching his or her first movie and thinking that the moving pictures are actually objects. So the obligation or the pathway to enlightenment includes kind of a destruction of the finite world for the material world. That is what is often overlooked when outsiders look at Kali and Shiva and these gods of destruction. It is not that Hinduism is a destructive religion. According to Houston Smith, they're just trying to point out the destruction in your mind of the finite world for the infinite reality that actually exists. And at the end of this section, Houston Smith sums up what kind of world we have. A multiple world that includes innumerable galaxies horizontally, innumerable tiers vertically, and innumerable cycles temporally. A moral world in which the law of karma is never suspended. A middling world that will never replace paradise as the spirit's destination. The world that is Maya, deceptively tricky in passing off its multiplicity, materiality, and dualities as ultimate when they are actually provisional. A training ground in which people can develop their highest capacities, and a world that is Leela, the play of the divine in its cosmic dance, untiring, unending, resistless, yet ultimately beneficent, with a grace born of infinite vitality. Which leads us to the next section, Many Paths to the Same Summit. Many Paths to the Same Summit. This is going to be a very quick section because it simply points out that for Hindus, Hinduism isn't the only path. In fact, they claim that the various major religions are actually alternate paths to the same goal. And Houston Smith points out further evidence to this is that Hinduism's 19th century saints sought God successfully through the practice of a number of the world's great religions. Ultimately, everyone should follow one's own religion. A Christian should follow Christianity, a Muslim should follow Islam, and so on. Nothing is going to speak to you more than the religion of your native land. And with that, we end Hinduism and move on to Buddhism. Buddhism, the man who woke up. One cannot start Buddhism without talking about Buddha himself. A man who responded to the question, "Are you a god?" as "No, I am awake," whose name denotes both wake up and to know. as Buddha itself means the enlightened one or the awakened one. But before we get to the enlightenment, we start with a humble prince, Siddhartha Gautama, his life and legend. Siddhartha Gautama was a prince. His father was a king. So as you can imagine, he was born into a life of luxury and abundance. But where we will start the story is in the legend of the 4 passing sights. So as the legend goes, when Siddhartha was born, a fortune teller said if he remained with the world, he would unify India and become her great conqueror, or universal king, a Chakravartin. However, if he forsook the world, he would become not a world conqueror, but a world redeemer. Now the father, he wanted him to become a universal king, the former destiny, and thus he spared no effort to keep his prince attached to worldly pleasures. This is where the 4 passing sights come in, because the father would clear roads of suffering so that when the prince would go through the roads and the markets, he would see no death and no suffering. But one day, an old man was overlooked, and thus he saw what it looked like to grow old. On the second ride, he encountered a body racked with disease. On the third day, he found a corpse. And on the 4th day, he saw a monk with a shaved head, a robe, and a bowl. And that is when he learned of the life of withdrawal from the world. He then thought to himself, life is subject to age and death. Where is the realm of life in which there is neither age nor death? This starts Siddhartha on his path towards enlightenment. He became determined to quell the snare of distractions and follow the true call of a truth seeker. He ordered the gatekeeper to bridle his great white legendary horse, and he set out towards the forest. He became enamored with Hinduism's Raja Yoga, as he was determined to break the power of the body's hold and crush its interference. But he ended up becoming so weak that he fell into faint, and thus he concluded the futility of asceticism, proposing the now famous Buddhist middle way, a pathway between extremities, between vice and virtue, between abundance and deficiency. But on one evening, near Gaya in northeast India, south of the present city of Patna, he sat down under the peepal tree, or Bodhi tree, short for Bodhi, or enlightenment. He sat himself down, and he was determined not to move until he reached enlightenment. In the legend, the evil one rose and chose many forms in order to break Siddhartha's concentration. First, choosing the form of Kama, the god of desire, and then Mara, the lord of death, challenging Siddhartha. And yet, Gautama's meditation deepened, until at last his mind pierced the last bubble of the universe and shattered it. The great awakening had arrived. Gautama had transformed. He now became the Buddha. But the evil one wasn't done yet, and tempted the Buddha one last time with reason, stating the futility of Buddha returning to India and preaching this notion, but instead should just slip into nirvana. And the Buddha replied with what would be his mission: there will be some who will understand. And thus the Buddha would return to India, preaching his ego-shattering, life-redeeming message, training monks, preaching publicly, counseling privately, advising the perplexed, encouraging the faithful, and comforting the distressed. And after a lengthy ministry of 45 years, at the age of 80, around the year 483 BC, the Buddha died from dysentery, after eating a meal of dried boar's flesh. And yet, in the midst of his pain, understanding that the cook might feel responsible for his death, His last request was that the cook be informed that of all the meals the Buddha had eaten, only two have stood out as having blessed him exceptionally. One was the meal whose strength enabled him to reach enlightenment under the bo tree, and the other one allowed him to open the final gates of nirvana. And as Houston Smith writes, two sentences from his valedictory have echoed through the ages. All compound things decay. Work out your own salvation with diligence. And now we will move to the Silent Sage. In this section, we learn a little bit more about the Buddha's mannerisms because, as Houston Smith states, it is paramount that one learn of the Buddha if one is to study Buddhism. So he is described as having a warm heart, but also being a great rationalist, preaching a religion of infinite compassion. And while he wasn't the most modest, he still rebuffed any category that insisted he was more than human. He even confessed that during his time under the Bodhi tree, if there had been any other drive as powerful as the drive of sex, he would have never made the grade. He also confessed that the months when he was first alone in the forest almost brought him to the brink of mortal terror. But he was also a man gifted with great insight into character. He was never taken by fraud and would seek out those of authenticity. One such story talks about Sunita, a poor outcast that the Buddha saw as being one with a genuine heart and carried the possibility of enlightenment like a lamp within a jar. Sunita ended up becoming a renowned member of the order. Yet, for all the descriptions the disciples could come up with, still, language alone could not satisfy what remained, the master's essence of mystery, this depth of consciousness. As Houston Smith writes, as for the disciples, what they could understand, they revered and loved. But there was more than they could hope to exhaust. To the end, he remained half light, half shadow, defying complete intelligibility. So they called him Sakyamuni, or the Silent Sage of the Sakya clan. And with that, we are going to move in to where the Buddha really shines for our purposes, as the rebel saint, a rebel to the Hinduism of his time. The rebel saint. And now we move from Buddha to Buddhism itself. But before we get started, it's imperative that we understand that Buddhism grew out of Hinduism. For Buddhism, even though it fully formed and appeared overnight, was still a reaction against Hindu perversions. That is to say, the perversions that existed in Hinduism at the time of the Buddha. Buddhism drew its lifeblood from Hinduism. But against the prevailing corruption, Buddhism recoiled from Hinduism like a whiplash and hit back hard. For Houston Smith, there are 6 aspects of religion that seem to surface so regularly that they suggest the seeds are in human makeup. These 6 are authority, and what he means by authority is like divine authority, because religion is complicated, thus some will naturally understand it better than others, and those people end up becoming the authority of which people seek out their advice. And then you have ritual. According to Houston Smith, religion rose out of celebration and its opposite bereavement, so both naturally cry out for collective expression. And then you have speculation, this idea of, where do we come from? Where do we go from here? Why are we here? Things like that. And then tradition is, as in human traditions, rather than instincts, is what passes down these wisdoms and bequeaths these wisdoms to the present people. And you have grace, this idea that reality is on our side. Then there's mystery. Being finite, the human mind cannot begin to fathom the infinite that it is drawn to. So there's this mystery in it. So these 6 seeds, I will call them, are important to religion, but can also clog up the works. And Houston Smith uses these 6 seeds to explain the Hinduism of Buddha's time. Authority had become hereditary and exploitative. Rituals became mechanistic as means for obtaining miraculous results. Speculation lost its experiential base and devolved into meaningless hair-splitting. Tradition turned into a dead weight, insisting that Sanskrit, which was no longer understood by their masses, remained the language of religious discourse. God's grace was being misread in ways that undercut human responsibility. Mystery was confused with perverse obsessions, with miracles and the occult and the fantastic. So this was the perversion of Hinduism during Buddha's time. And as a result, Buddha struck back with his 6. So the Buddha preached a religion devoid of authority to break the monopolistic grip of the Brahmins. And he stated, do not accept what you hear by report. Do not accept tradition. Do not accept a statement because it's found in our books. Be lamps unto yourselves. Those who look to themselves shall reach the topmost height. He preached a religion devoid of ritual. Belief in the rites and efficacy and ceremony is one of the 10 fetters that bind the human spirit. Buddha also skirted speculation. What this means is these ultimate questions that really had no answer, he didn't even bother with. He gives a great example of a person who is pierced with a poisonous arrow, and that individual starts asking, I'm not going to pull this out or seek help until I know what kind of string was used to fling this arrow, what the arrow is made out of, what kind of bow it came from, where the individual was standing, what kind of individual was it, what they believed in. This person would die before finding all of his answers. What he wants and what he states is that he focused on suffering. Suffering have I explained, the cause of suffering, the destruction of suffering, and the path that leads to the destruction of suffering I have explained, for this is useful. The Buddha preached a religion devoid of tradition, saying slip free from the past burdens. Do not go by what is handed down, nor on the authority of traditional teachings. Buddha preached a religion intense in self-effort. Do not resign to the notion that rebirth is unending. It is for everyone. It is not just for the Brahmins. Work out your salvation with diligence. The fact that many believed only the Brahmins could achieve enlightenment, he found ridiculous. The Buddha also, and lastly, preached a religion devoid of the supernatural. All appeals to the supernatural and reliance on it amounted to shortcuts, easy answers, and simple solutions that only diverted attention from the hard, practical task of self-advance. And in here we find the original Buddhism. It is empirical. A true disciple must know for themselves, him or herself. It is scientific, for you must discover the cause and effect relationships that affect experience. It's pragmatic. The Buddha kept his attention riveted on predicaments that demand solutions like suffering. It was therapeutic. Did not ask you your opinions or your religion, but what is your suffering? Where does your suffering come from? It's psychological. It began with human loss, its problems, and the dynamics of coping with this loss. It's egalitarian. Men and women were capable of enlightenment. From all forms of social class or caste, everyone had a chance to reach enlightenment. And lastly, it was directed towards individuals. It was not blind to the social side of human nature, but it appealed to the individual that should proceed towards enlightenment through confronting his or her individual situations and predicaments. And with that, we have reached the end of this lecture. We will continue on in the next lecture, going over the philosophical portions of Buddhism, and start with the Four Noble Truths.